Kia ora, now welcome back to Culture Connection. You're with Jesil. Our time is 3:07, and with us is Professor Alberto Costi from Faculty of Law, Victoria, University of Wellington. And we're going to talk about Russia-Ukraine crisis and whether international law is effective. Briefly, Professor Alberto Costi teaches public international law with specializations in the law of armed conflict, international criminal law, international human rights law, the law of international organizations, and international environmental law, and in comparative law and European Union law. And it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Alberto Costi here at Hot City FM. Professor, how are you?
Very well, very well. Thank you very much for welcoming me on your show.
Oh, it's a pleasure, really. We have a lot to talk about Russia-Ukraine crisis. So let's cut right to the chase here. Are we witnessing the prelude to World War III?
Well, that's an important question. I like to think it's a bit too early to say, because so far most people have interpreted wrongly some of the moves that President Putin has made. Sometimes we've thought it was just strategic moves to try to influence his position at the negotiation table, yet he's moved on to let the military intervene. So I would like to think it's too early and that this is probably more a threat than reality, but we will need to see. It is a dangerous moment in history.
Dangerous, you see it. How worried should we be?
I think we should be reasonably worried, simply because of the erratic course of action of the Kremlin since 2014 and the rather unfortunate rhetoric used by President Putin to the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine. Also, I think we should be worried not only about the action by Putin and Russia, but also because it's not really clear yet how other world players will act and react, whether it's China, Iran, North Korea. We've seen how Turkey seems to have taken a position a bit away from Russia. So we should be worried because various diverging interests are at play at this moment.
Why is Russia attacking Ukraine? Well,
there are certainly some historical reasons in which I will not indulge simply because I'm not an historian. But if we look at recent history, the end of the Cold War, the eastward move by NATO, the loss of influence of Russia over some of the former Soviet republics, and I think as well the presence of a large ethnic Russian population in Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, are factors that may at least explain in part the conduct of President Putin.
Why does Russia care so much about Ukraine?
Well, it may be considered in part as a buffer zone between NATO and Russia. So we know that Romania is a partner, Hungary partners within NATO. So I think that Hungary, the Ukraine rather, is kind of the last bastion in a way. So not only is it considered a buffer zone between NATO and Russia, but also, and this has been used as one reason for intervention, it's the alleged mistreatment of Russian minorities in eastern Ukraine. That is something that already goes back to the conflict of 2014, but I think it has been played out in the media by President Putin.
Is this really what Putin wants, or what does he really want? Is it, saving this minority, or does he have a large object on his mind pursuing this aggression to Ukraine?
These are very important questions. I would say that partly it is, I think, a genuine perception. I don't say that it is right, but a perception that Russia is coming under threat of an alliance, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that was created at the beginning of the Cold War, and that the alliance has really moved eastward more and more, and I think that is one issue. The second issue as well is that I think that Russia, at least some people in Russia, still believe that there is such a connection within Ukraine and Russia, going back I think mostly to 10th or 11th century, that really makes it a question of principle. And I think that these are some of the elements why it is so important for Russia, and it is in fact, in part as well, to be able to show that it is still a superpower.
Putin said, absolutely not, we don't want Ukraine to join NATO. Why is this? What is the significance of this?
I think for Russia, it's significant, and certainly the way he's portrayed it in the media in the last few weeks is that a move from NATO to include the Ukraine is in fact a threat, a veiled threat to Russia. Even though one has to remember that NATO's members will protect each other. So there is a clause, Article 5 in the NATO treaty, that says if one state is victim of an armed attack, the other states should come to its rescue. But this is a defensive alliance. I think Putin is really trying to portray the alliance as an offensive alliance, and that therefore, if it reaches the Ukraine, it is at the borders with Russia, and that is a threat to Russia.
This, like what you said, this has historical objectives long time ago, and even we foresaw it coming. But who is to blame in Ukraine crisis? Like, there is United Nations, there is Russia, there is Ukraine, but how come we arrive at this point of violence?
Well, I think the easy answer would be that it's mostly Russia that is to blame. However, I would say, I say mostly because I would say that the West has remained tentative, especially over the last few years, about allowing Ukraine to become a member of NATO, where the European Union has sometimes been a bit tentative in the relation it wants to have with Ukraine. So I think that if one can be cynical, I think that the current situation exists in part because some of the moves that are discussed now, like in the last 36, 72 hours, if they would have occurred earlier, maybe we would not have this kind of issue. But I think that even though Russia is to blame, I think the West has always been ambiguous towards its relation with the Ukraine, and also I would say the United Nations. I think this shows once again the weakness in practice of the role of the United Nations.
Let's tackle this United Nations weakness and perhaps ineffectiveness shortly. But, of course, looking at the statistics and looking at all the ammunitions and the power and the strength, Ukraine is outgunned and outnumbered in every sense, if we look at it. Apart from Putin himself, who can effectively stop Putin?
Well, that's an interesting question. Now, without wanting to sound too theoretical, but often in a state, I would say the armed forces, at the end of the day, in most states, armed forces will adhere to the principles of the law of armed conflict, or what we call nowadays international humanitarian law, IHL. I think that soldiers, and especially their commanders, understand the rules and the need to respect these rules. If only because if you do not want to do to others what others might do to you. So I think there is a question of reciprocity. And I think that armed forces understand the need to conduct warfare within some principle, within some parameters. And I think that is really creating an issue here, is that to what extent will soldiers, or at least the commanders, continue to follow orders, especially if that involves at some point the threat to use nuclear weapons. So from a domestic viewpoint, if you ask me the question, who can effectively stop Putin, I do not know enough about Russian politics to know the extent to which a democratic movement could take to the streets along the line of what we have seen in many ex-Soviet republics over the last few decades. But I think that unless there is a democratic wave and in fact that some of the authorities, whether police or armed forces, take a role on their side, I think that this conflict will have to be negotiated still. The end of this conflict will be negotiated with Putin.
Is this just madness from Putin, or is this calculated attack? What do you think?
I wouldn't want to bet on what will happen, but I would like to think that it is still someone who views with nostalgia the Soviet Union, and that he perceives that the way the West has treated Russia in the last 3 decades has been patronizing, and that it is time for Russia to show that the world that it is still a superpower.
Let's talk about the United Nations. The United Nations was established specifically to prevent a global war, or i.e. World War III. And since then, we haven't really seen this sort of event in the past 75 years. And now it happens. Has the UN lost its effectiveness or teeth or strength in this situation?
Let me answer that in 3 ways. First of all, we have actually witnessed this sort of events more than once, but probably to some of the older listeners, they will remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 as being one of the most dramatic standoffs between East and West. And if eventually Russia or the Soviet Union accepted to retake all its the construction of to stop the construction of missile bases in Cuba. So there have been a number of events, but I think the question whether the UN has lost its effectiveness is important, because it was set up in 1945 with the idea that on the Security Council would sit the winning nations of the Second World War. The world has changed. Some reforms have taken place at the United Nations, but at the level of the Security Council, this has not occurred. And the problem is that when a crisis involves one of the 5 permanent members, well, then the Security Council is very much blocked. And that is such a case here, because any sanctions against Russia at the level of Security Council that would therefore bind all the members of the United Nations, that is not possible, because Russia has a right of veto.
Yes. When it comes to international law, for our listeners right now, what laws that Russia has violated right now?
I think the clearest violations at the time, at this time, if we take the orthodox view of what is happening, is a violation of the sovereignty of Ukraine, its territorial integrity, because you have foreign soldiers that represent another sovereign state walking and acting within the territory of Ukraine. It's also the pressure, in fact, even before this intervention since Friday, but even before that, all the pressure that Russia seems to have put by massing troops along the borders, by probably some involvement in some of the eastern breakaway republics in Ukraine. I think one could also say there's been an interference in the internal affairs of the Ukraine. When I say interference in the capacity of Ukraine to decide its political system, its economic system, its foreign and internal policies. And in addition to that, obviously, there are also possibly some violations of international humanitarian law that we will find out about them after the conflict ends. But I've read in some news media about civilians being targeted. That would be a possible war crime. And there's targeting of buildings that are not military objectives that could also lead to violations by Russia of its obligations under the Geneva Conventions and under the law of armed conflict.
How is international law enforced?
That is the question that students always ask, and the problem is at this very moment there is no international police force to ensure that countries like Russia comply with international law. It is very much based on a question of a reaction. It's action and reaction. What Russia does, well, there's intervening, invading Ukraine. How do other states react? There are reactions by statements, reaction by sanctions being taken, and maybe and sending weapons to Ukraine. I think there is a very large majority of states that find this behavior by Russia unacceptable. It's a violation of international law. However, how to enforce international law? It is, in fact, to force Russia, in fact, to withdraw from Ukrainian territory, which is easier said than done.
Mm-hmm. So basically, it is about compliance of a member state, like in this case, Russia. But Russia does not comply, and you said economic sanctions, and I want to tackle about economic sanctions here because that actions or sanctions can only have an indirect impact on deterring or ending a war. How effective is economic sanctions at the moment?
They rarely work effectively
Yes.
unless... pardon me? Yeah, they do work rarely effectively unless there is consensus and unless there is a firm commitment by all states that will do the same. Unfortunately, in the past, when we look at sanctions against Iraq in the late 1990s, there were either loopholes that existed, or also some states finally ignored them, or there was kind of secret trade going on. So I think that is the big problem. For sanctions to be felt, sanctions will work in the long term. I am not sure they can work in a matter of days if we look at economic sanctions or diplomatic sanctions. They will work within a certain time, but rarely will they work effectively immediately.
Mm-hmm. And because they take years for the sanctions to take effect, then that means that Russia can buy time, Putin can buy time. The idea that the pain of sanction is less than he anticipates, and therefore it gives him incentive to actually keep pushing this aggression. So do you agree with that? And what are other options under international law to actually stop Putin?
Yeah, well, theoretically, the extreme position would be that Ukraine would ask another state to exercise to use force in self-defense on behalf of Ukraine. Self-defense is something that can be undertaken by a state that is a victim of an armed attack, or on behalf of that state if that state requests another state to act on its behalf. But this is really going to the extreme that could lead eventually to a world war, or at least a European war. Other than that, economic sanctions, diplomatic sanctions, but recalling ambassadors from Moscow will not do much. I think that Putin is in fact betting on the lack of appetite of Western nations to send in troops. And I don't think there is much appetite. It would take something really violent to, I think, get a Western state to intervene. I think that it is in part what gives Putin the idea that sanctions, well, I'm not sure he will suffer them that much individually himself, and I'm not sure his entourage will. My concern is that the Russian population, many of whom are not in favor of such a conflict, will be the ones to suffer.
Mm-hmm. I want to pick up on self-defense that you talk about there. Self-defense is, only justification for use of force against another country, in this case, Ukraine. Is Russia justified using its force to invade Ukraine? Again, the reason being, his legitimate reason. There are minority Russians in Ukraine, and they've been maltreated. Is that enough to justify the use of self-defense?
Well, Putin tried, I think, in a rather simplistic way last week, that by recognizing the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, recognizing them as independent states, he's argued that, in fact, they are coming in to protect those states, to protect Russian minorities against crimes of genocide. So he has tried, by recognizing those republics, and in his discourse, in his narrative, he's in fact really tried to say that the intervention of Russia is legitimate. And from a purely abstract point of view, that's not untrue. A state can always ask another state to come in to exercise use of force in self-defense. The issue, though, is that there is absolutely no account of genocide occurring in eastern Ukraine. whatever conflict there is between Ukraine and those republics, it is an internal armed conflict. And from a point of view of international law, it would be very simplistic to try and make an argument that Russia is legitimized in intervening on a right of self-defense. It looks to me, at least, and I'm quite objective in this, it looks really as an armed attack, which is an act of aggression.
So what implications of Russia's, like what you said, intentional violations of international law to other countries, for example, like China? Does this set a bad precedent? Are we seeing more and more dictatorial country, like invading sovereign states, whatever their wishes?
Well, immediately when we think about China, and in the media there's been reports about is China waiting to see whether it could undertake similar action against Taiwan, for instance, and this is really something that we need to be very careful about, because the Security Council is blocked in reality. It cannot really do anything. And when one of the permanent five, whether it is China, Russia, or France, the UK, or the United States, once they are involved in such a crisis, there is very little the Security Council can do. So yes, in theory, China could see this as being that if the West's response is not strong enough, they might see as, well, we'll try with Taiwan. I think that it is one issue that we'll need to be very careful about. But China, I will probably be thinking twice, because China also has a lot, besides military or national sovereign interest, also has a lot of economic interests at play, that is for which it needs to be very careful. But I think you're right. Not only looking at China, but looking at any regime that feels the part of another state's territory should be its own, that could be seen as a legitimization. If Russia does that, as it did with Crimea, why can't we do that too?
Is it impossible to remove Russia from the Security Council? Because, again, Security Council is so powerful because they can veto any vote, resolution. So is it possible that Russia can be removed from the Security Council? And if it is yes, how do we do that?
The simple answer is no, because Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council. Any changes, any amendments to the Charter of the United Nations, including who is on the Security Council, the voting rights on the Security Council, are all part of the Charter. So in reality, and all amendments, major amendments to the Charter of the United Nations will require the support of the five members. So in what I mean is that really it's unlikely. Russia has a right of veto, and even on changes. So it is not possible in the current framework of the United Nations to be able to act without Russia. So the call by President Zelensky that Russia should not have a right to vote on Security Council, it is not possible, not in the current Charter of the United Nations.
And that makes international law ineffective. Would you agree?
No, I would not. I mean, partly you are correct, because members of the United Nations accepted such a difficulty with the Security Council when they adopted it at the end of the Second World War. But you also have to look beyond the Security Council, because, and I think that today it was raised in the media, that the General Assembly can also meet in an emergency session, when a majority of the members of the Security Council invoke a resolution that was passed, in fact, in 1950, called the Uniting for Peace resolution. It's a procedural resolution, so there's no right of veto. The veto does not apply. And that by that resolution, it's as if the members of the Security Council accept that the Security Council is blocked, and they allow or they give mandate to the General Assembly to look into the matter. Now, the General Assembly cannot take any binding resolutions, certainly not on matters of peace and security. However, it prompts a debate, a discussion, condemnation probably of the acts of Russia before the General Assembly. And in reality, it would be possible, like it happened at the beginning of the Korean War in 1950, that it might well be that it kind of legitimized the action of individual member states who could be therefore, like in 1950, a non-binding resolution was allowed a discussion and a debate by which at the end of which the United States and a number of other states entered the Korean War on the side of South Korea. But they were not doing that because it was a mandate of the United Nations, but because South Korea had asked for their help. But what I mean, it is possible for others. The Security Council is an organ of an international organization, even though it is global. Individually, states could come to the rescue of Ukraine if Ukraine asked for such a role. The problem, though, and that's the bet that Putin is taking, no one wants a fight with Russia, and probably not with a Russian regime that might be perceived from outside not to be stable.
Let's talk about Putin, because he's the center of this all. In fact, like what you said, he's not solidly supported by all Russians, as we can see demonstrations in Moscow and everywhere. And under international criminal law, can Putin be prosecuted for his crimes?
Well, that's interesting, because if we look, for instance, at the International Criminal Court that is in function since the middle of 2002, neither Ukraine or Russia is a party to the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. So it would be quite difficult, it would not be possible or very unlikely. What can happen, though, is that Putin could be prosecuted before the national courts, the domestic courts in Russia, unlikely to happen, or theoretically, he could be prosecuted before an international tribunal that would be set up to that effect. Again, not likely. Eventually, he could be prosecuted before the domestic court of another state, where there is in place a law that allows the prosecution of a foreign national, of any person, in fact, for war crimes or crimes against humanity or crimes of aggression. But that is, again, quite unlikely that Putin would be extradited to another state. So I think that the possibility of prosecuting, of holding Putin responsible for violation of international criminal law are quite difficult at this stage. And to be frank, between you and me and your listeners, I think it is, again, part of the bet that is taken, that no one will eventually do that, I think.
I'd like to unpack about those parts of the world where there is universal jurisdiction and their domestic law. And can you name few countries where there is possibility that Putin might be tried?
Oh, most states do have in place in their criminal codes or in specific legislation, like we do have here in New Zealand.
Do we have in New Zealand?
Yes, it's the ICC Act of 2000. I forget the formal title, but it's really called very much the International Criminal Court Act of 2000. It is possible for New Zealand courts to prosecute someone who's committed war crimes, crimes against humanity in another jurisdiction, in another country. The only issue, though, is that for that person to be prosecuted, they should be here before our courts, and it will require simply the Attorney General to accept, to kind of provide his or her accord to an arrest warrant being emitted against the person. So that is possible. There's been a lot of situations in the past where someone has been prosecuted because there is in place a legislation, universal jurisdiction, as you mentioned. It is one of the principles of jurisdictions by which a state can make laws and applies them not only to someone within their territory, but to someone located overseas where they've committed an act which the law believes is illegal. The problem, though, is that unless the person appears within your jurisdiction, it is difficult to carry out the prosecution. But that would be a possibility, again, unless Putin willingly or Putin is extradited once removed from power. I think that is quite unlikely, because in most legal systems, a trial will only proceed for a criminal matter, will only proceed if the person is, at least at the beginning of the trial, in front of the judge, before the judge. But it is technically a possibility. I doubt at this stage that Putin sees that as an impediment to his actions in Ukraine.
Another question. U.S. President Biden has given $350 million worth of military aid to Ukraine. How do you think Putin will take this?
Well, I think that at this stage, Putin has already, or probably already sees all these actions as being actions taken by the U.S., the UK. I mean, the amount of money and weapons being directed towards Ukraine as being just reinforcing his view that Russia is coming under attack. And the concern is that at the moment it's kind of in indirect help, indirect assistance. The problem is that I think it just further reinforces, as I said, Putin's view that Western nations are trying to really threaten Russia.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that this war can end?
Well, that's a very important question. I would like to think that at some point, I'm not exactly sure what Putin's endgame is. If it is simply to sit the jurisdiction of Russia in eastern Ukraine, as it has done without a doubt since 2014 over Crimea, that might be why Kremlin is ready to have discussions with Ukraine at the border with Belarus. However, it is difficult to read into the mind of President Putin at the moment, because I think that if nothing is done to limit what's happening in Ukraine, beside the fact that it's a humanitarian crisis that I never would have thought could have occurred in Europe in 2022, my concern has to do as well with some of the new members of NATO, and especially the Baltic republics, that could feel, because also there is a large ethnic Russian minority. Would that be the next step for further campaign? So I think it is important to see in the coming days. We will see, hopefully, where this will end. But I think that's what Western nations and NATO members have to be very careful, because I'm not sure what is really the end game, whether it's really becoming a zero-sum game, and where either it's simply Ukraine or whether there are further objectives that Putin wants to achieve.
Yes.
Very difficult.
Recently, or just a few hours ago, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, agrees to start peace talks with Russia. Do you think this is really just a show-off, or is this a sign that Putin has actually realized that, oh wow, the reaction of the international community is tough and strong, so I better give in? Do you think that's what he's thinking?
My first thought when I heard about this and the fact that Ukraine was ready to have conversations with Kremlin, I thought that the Kremlin's this was an attempt by the Kremlin to be able to finally furnish some supplies to its troops and its tanks seem to be a bit stuck in the middle of Ukraine without any support. I think probably that the Kremlin's game, if it is really to just sit its jurisdiction over eastern Ukraine, might be that they believe they have done enough to secure the Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbass region. But at the moment, it is a bit difficult. I believe that for Ukraine, it is important to show and continue to show not only resilience, but also to show that they are level-headed and that they believe that the best way is to try and talk at the table to stop this madness and this humanitarian catastrophe. I think that, but I am not sure that the problem is that really, what are the end objectives? If Ukraine says, well, no, you cannot have those two Eastern Ukrainian republics, and if Russia wants not only those two republics, but also ensure that that Ukraine is never a member of NATO, then I'm not sure where they will find kind of a consensus, a concerted agreement where to go. That's my concern. What happens if these negotiations are not fruitful?
Mm-hmm. Professor Alberto Costi, thank you so much. Gracias, Namihi, for your time here at Hat City FM 106.7.